Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for Vacant Possessions, What Realtors Need to Know. Let's jump right in. Today we have Jim Garnett, President of Canadian Tenant Inspection Services. Jim comes to us with a background working with the RCMP and 15 years as a transit police officer. So please welcome Jim.
Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about the 2-month notice to end tenancy for landlord's use of the property and how to deal with that notice, the process to go through when you get a firm deal in place and you're looking for a place to go and what to do next. Then we're going to talk about the 2-month notice and how to best use it. So what is it and why is it important to realtors? Well, the 2-month notice is an RTB form that is necessary in order to end a tenancy for landlord's use of the property. It's important to realtors because if you have a purchase sale going on and you're dealing with the landlord on the one side slash vendor and the purchaser on the other side, then in order for the purchasing client to be able to use the property for their own use, not as a tenancy, then that form has to come into play. And so that's where that comes up. We're going to talk about the process, overview and key considerations, potential risk and mitigation strategies, and some tools and resources. And of course, at the end, we'll have a Q&A so that everyone has a chance to ask any questions that they have. I'll answer them the best I can. If I can't answer them, then I'm probably going to refer you to the residential tenancy branch. Much faster if you get my answer, though. So the 2-month notice to end tenancy for landlord's use of the property is just that and nothing more. Okay. It is a. We have a little bit of a problem here. Hang on. I'll just. There we go. It's an RTB document that serves 60 days notice on the tenants that requires the tenants to move a clear 2 months after being served. By a clear 2 months, I mean that it has to be served on the tenant before the first day of the first of the 2 months. So i.e. You want the tenant to move out by September the 30th, 2022. You have to serve the notice on the tenants by no later than July 31st if you're serving them in person, July 28th if you're posting the notice on their door, or July 26th if you're serving it by registered mail. So our company prefers to do it by registered mail. We've been in business for about 14 years, and we have used all 3 methods of service, and I'll share later why it is that we prefer registered mail. One of the most important things that you as realtors can explain to a tenant is the consequence of a landlord serving a 2-month notice in bad faith. And we see this all the time. We'll get a call from a landlord saying, I own this property. What I'd really like to do is I'd like to renovate it, have the tenant move out, renovate it, and I want to raise the rent. Or I want to renovate it and then I want to sell it. But that's not what I want to tell the tenant. I want to serve them a 2-month notice so that they'll move out and then I can go on and do what I want to do with the property, even and realizing, of course, that it is in bad faith. So quite simply, that action can result in the landlord being assessed with a penalty of 12 months rent that they would have to pay the tenant if the landlord does not operate within the spirit of the notice. And you know, every story that comes along has its little twist to it, and quite often with us, it'll start out by them telling us that they want to serve a notice for landlord's use of the property, or they've already served the notice for landlord's use of the property. And they're looking for us to kind of lead them through the path that will give them that vacant possession to allow them to do whatever it is they intend to do with it. And quite simply, it either has to be the landlord or an immediate member of the landlord's family who are going to use the property as a residence. And if they're changing the use of the property or anything like that, they're going to run afoul of RTB whenever they end up in an arbitration. So why should realtors care, and what role do they play in this? Well, realtors want to be seen as going the extra step for their clients by making them aware of the timelines, the RTB process, and by pointing out the possible consequences of making errors along the way. Your level of professionalism will automatically take a leap. When you start telling your client that, you know what, there's a process here and this is what the process is, and if you don't follow this process, here's what the consequences of that could be for you. I want to see this happen properly for you, so this is what you're going to have to do in order to make that happen. Because oftentimes we'll see it where somebody's purchasing a place and they're saying, well, we'll just serve a 2-month notice and we'll move somebody else in there and we'll get more rent, and that way we'll be able to afford our mortgage payments better. We'll make this place cash flow better by doing it this way. And in order to do that, they're going to have to misrepresent the facts, put themselves in a really bad situation in terms of RTB and possibly financial situation as a result of that. So this all starts with a firm deal. Once the deal becomes firm, the process begins. The firm deal is in place. The purchaser wishes to use the home for personal reasons, meaning for themselves or a personal member of their family. Then once the purchaser makes their intentions known to their realtor prepares a BC REA form for service on the vendor's realtor. This form instructs the vendor to issue a 2-month notice to end tenancy on the vendor's tenant. It's very important that nothing in the process can move forward unless that BC REA form is in place if the 2-month notice is going to be used. And if the BC REA form is not in place, when it goes to an arbitration, it's going to get denied. It's that simple. They look for that form, the arbitrators are looking for it. If it doesn't represent part of the evidence package, then the landlord or the vendor's case is going to get tossed. It's that simple. So the landlord issues the 2-month notice to end tenancy. And they expect that out of that, the tenant is just going to move. And we're going to come back to this point a little bit later here. The landlord must complete a proof of service in the proper format after the tenant has been served with the notice. If they do not, they'll have problems when the matter gets to an arbitration. And it's important to know that if the notice is by personal service or by posting on the door, the vendor or landlord will require a witness to be present. The only exception to this is if the tenant signs the proof of service to acknowledge service. This is why we prefer to use registered mail to serve tenants. You still have to complete the proof of service, but your registered mail receipt and tracking number become your witness. Also, when you serve by registered mail, the tenant is deemed served after 5 days. And the count for the 15 days to dispute will start after the 5 days since the registered mail was sent. So it's all pretty straightforward. We get people phoning us all the time. We've served the tenant. That's fine. Have you completed a proof of service? Yes. How did you serve the tenant? I handed them a copy of it. Did they sign a proof of service to acknowledge the receipt of it? No. Okay. Or we posted it on the door. Okay. When did you post it on the door? How many days before? We go through the process. Who witnessed it? Who witnessed you serve the tenant with the 2-month notice? Who witnessed you posting it on the door? Well, nobody did. You're back to the start. And we realize that in real estate transactions, everything is on a timeline. So when you lose time because of things like documents being served without being properly witnessed, it can cost you a bunch of time that could put your deal in jeopardy at some point. So it's really important that when you're dealing with these things that you get the process down, you understand the process enough that if I'm serving a notice, I have to do a proof of service. It's that simple. We end up with people calling us all the time and giving us the story of how they've got to the point that they're phoning us. And generally along the way, it includes something like, yeah, I served them the notice and nobody witnessed it. And this is how I did it. I slid it under the door. Sliding under the door is not valid service in the province of British Columbia. If you say that you slid it under the door, your case is gone before you start. And posting it in the proper way or serving it in the proper way are just things that you have to do in order for the RTB process to move forward in a way that's going to be favorable to you and your client. So it's really, I found out a little bit because it's so important. And if there's no proof of service, then it's easy for an arbitrator to say, well, if you can't prove that the tenant was ever properly served, then you're going to have to start the process over again and make sure that it's done properly next time. So then the landlord has a right once they've served the notice on day 15 days after, the tenant has a right to dispute. On day 16, the landlord has a right to dispute if the tenant has not disputed. Now, why is this important? This is important because you have to understand right from the get-go. I'll just catch up with myself a little bit here. But you have to understand right from the get-go that in today's environment, it takes 12 to 16 weeks in order to get an order of possession. I know from personal experience that I've written up deals to purchase properties where we've set the closing date out at 6 to 8 weeks. And we have done that because that's what it would take for everything to get in place, to get financing in place, to get inspections in place, and to do all those things, and to sometimes to sell a property in order to do it. So from our perspective in doing that, we felt that we had enough time. And if we were dealing with the tenanted situation, we knew that at that time it took 6 to 8 weeks to get through the process with the residential tenancy branch in order to get vacant possession of a unit by way of something like a 2-month notice. So when you're dealing with this right now in today's environment, you're looking at 12 to 16 weeks to get an order of possession if the tenant disputes or if the tenant does not dispute. And this is what you have to understand when you're writing up a deal where there's a tenant involved and where the landlord wants use of the property for their own purposes, is that you need to leave that window in place of 12 to 16 weeks where you're going to be able to follow or have the landlord follow the process to an order of possession through the residential tenancy branch. Writing it up as a 6 to 8 week contract does not work anymore. And Just to give you an example of what happens when these things go sideways. We had an example like January the 2nd of this year, where a realtor called us and said, gee, we have a little bit of a problem here. Tenants in this house where there's a firm deal in place and the transaction is going to close next week on the 7th. The tenants are saying they're not moving. And we don't know what to do about that. So we, of course, we asked, have they been served with a 2-month notice? Yes, they have. Did whoever served the 2-month notice, did they complete a proof of service? Yes, they did. Yeah, we made sure they did that. Great. On day 16, after they were served the notice, did anybody file for an order of possession? Well, no, we just anticipated that the tenants would move. Okay, did tenants ever tell you they were going to move? No. Did they ever tell the landlord they were going to move? No. Okay, so you have to assume that moving forward, you have to do something. If the tenants aren't indicating that they're moving, haven't given anybody even a hint that they're going to move, and in fact, they've told you that they're not going to move, that there must be something else that you have to do in order to, well, can't you just get them out? You serve them the notice, and it says right on the front of it that if the tenants do not dispute this notice, then they're deemed to accept the terms of the notice, which is absolutely true. That's what it says on the front of the notice, but it's not the practice that the residential tenancy branch really follows. It's fine when you get to an arbitration to point out that they did not dispute it, but absolutely everything goes to an arbitration. So if the tenants do not dispute, according to the 2 months notice, they're deemed to have accepted the notice, and you might expect that they'll just move out on the effective date. In actual fact, it doesn't happen more often than we want to admit. Okay, so that the only way that the landlord can ensure that the tenants will move out by the order of possession date or by the effective date of the deal is by way of an order of possession issued by RTB as a result of an arbitration. So that's when we tell people to file for an order of possession on day 16. That's exactly what we're trying to get across to them, is that you have to assume that the tenants are not going to cooperate and they're not going to move. And if you assume that right off the bat, then you'll take the necessary steps, or the landlord will take the necessary steps to make sure that that happens. And as realtors, if you're representing the vendor, then it's really important that you get the point across to them that they have to follow the process right through, like they're going to get an order of possession. And oftentimes we'll be talking to the landlord side of it, the vendor side of it, and they'll be saying, but these people have been here for 4 years, they're lovely people, they look after the place, we've actually become quite good friends with them. We're sure that they're not going to in any way delay their move from the place, so we've given them the notice. Those are the ones that come back to bite people more often than not. Because when people start looking around at what's going on in the real estate market, what's going on in the rental market, they come to understand that it's difficult to find a place to move to. So it's easier for them to dig in and fight than it is to go looking for a place and find a place to move to. So that's how these things unfold the way they do, and why so often people run into problem situations is because they take too much for granted. So the only way that you can be sure that the tenants are done with the place is if they're handing the keys over to you and telling you that they're surrendering custody of the unit. So then the basic move, you serve the notice, you've done the proof of service, the tenants have basically accepted it, 60 days goes by and they move out. That's the perfect scenario. And perfect scenarios don't happen all the time. And I'm sure that as realtors, you've probably come to understand that more than most people. So when you're looking at the 60 days, and the 60 days comes and goes, and everything is great, and the tenant's moved out, and vacant possession is assured, then your deal closes as it should, and everybody moves on. But as I say, that is not always the case. So when we're going to go back to this slide about the landlord serving the 2-month notice. So the tenant may file for a dispute. And if the tenant files for dispute, then RTB is going to say that's fine. In 12 to 16 weeks, we're going to have a hearing. And that are in the form of an arbitration, and the arbitration will decide whether or not the tenant has to move. And out of that arbitration, the landlord hopes to get an order of possession. And that's where this whole bad faith thing comes into play. And if a bad faith suggestion is made during the arbitration, the arbitrator will explore absolutely every avenue of questioning available to them to try and substantiate what this allegation of bad faith is. And if they can establish that there's bad faith, then the landlord is not going to get an order of possession, and that puts your deal in jeopardy. And the last thing you want at that point is for lawyers to get involved, tempers to flare, and just your deal unraveling because it didn't happen the way that it was supposed to. And oftentimes, if you can flesh out on your end what the vendor's intentions are or what the purchaser's intentions are, then you can make the right decisions and give them the right advice as you go along to avoid having one of these things implode on you and cause a big problem. So you go to the hearing, you're able to substantiate everything, an order of possession is coming forward. The next thing that has to happen is the order of possession has to be served on the tenants. And after it's served on the tenants are given so much time to get out of the rental unit. Oftentimes, if it happens before the closing date, then the landlord will receive an order of possession that says the closing date will be the effective date of the order of possession. Excuse me. And that's really what you want. If the tenants don't move on the closing date and the order of possession is in place, then the landlord is in the driver's seat to obtain a writ of possession in Supreme Court. And with that, they can activate bailiffs to go in and remove the tenants if they're resistant. So now, if during the course of this process, the closing date arrives and ownership of the property changes, but RTB has not yet had an arbitration with respect to this matter, then things change a little bit. And at that point, it's incumbent on the landlord to make sure that they serve a new document on RTB that includes the purchaser as a landlord on the form, and as a result on the dispute file. And once that's done, then whoever the arbitrator is will be better able to issue an order of possession to the new owner as opposed to the previous owner. And this is kind of a sticking point, and we've only recently come across it because of a couple of files that we've had. And because proper notice had not been given, we had to prove somehow during the arbitration that the purchaser was actually the new owner of the place. And one of the ways that you can do that quite simply is to, as soon as the state of title certificate is available, make sure that if you're representing the purchaser, that file, the certificate of title certificate, ends up on that file. And if that becomes apparent to the arbitrator, they may be able to use that in determining that this is who the owner of the place is, this is who the order of possession's name should bear, sort of thing. So if you do that, then you're in a better position to do that. And again, these are things that if you don't do them, you'll be starting over again. And if you're already 12 to 16 weeks into the process by the time you get into an arbitration, the absolute last thing you want to do is to try to start that whole process over again, because quite simply, by the time you do that, you're going to be so far down the road, unless you've got a really persistent purchaser or a very understanding vendor, you're going to have big problems. And I don't think that as a realtor, I know that my company carries errors and omissions insurance. I know we have general liability insurance and that sort of thing. I know that managing brokers carry all kinds of insurance and everything to make sure that if something goes sideways in a deal, that they're not overly exposed, that their realtors working in their offices are not overexposed from a legal perspective. And that's certainly nothing that any of us want to be a part of. You know, if we can avoid those things by just following the simple process and doing it the right way, then it makes life so much easier. So on the left here, you'll see that the key timeline consideration for realtors. If you're still in the habit of writing these deals up at 6 to 8 weeks down the road for a closing, in situations where it's a tenanted property and there's a 2-month notice involved, don't do that. Please leave yourself enough time. It's going to be 12 to 16 weeks to get an arbitration. It's much easier to move a closing date up than it is to push it back. I've been on both sides of that, where I wanted the timeline to be moved, and if both parties aren't playing ball, then it's a very difficult thing. And I found that it's much easier to move a closing date up than it is to move it back, and I'm sure that maybe a lot of you have had the same experience. So the order, the whole thing about the landlord filing for the order of possession, the sooner that it's done, the better. Okay, if a landlord is on top of their game, and we do this all the time, if we're dealing with whatever notices, and some of you may know that there's a 1-month notice to end tenancy under the Tenancy Act. There's a 2-month notice, which is the one that we're talking about today. And there's a 4-month notice, which some of you may be involved with as well from time to time, where redevelopment of a property is taking place or demolition of a property is taking place. And in those notices, the format has now changed for the 4-month notice, where it's really become an involved situation where the tenant would have up to a month to dispute it. And if they don't dispute it, or they do dispute it, it doesn't matter. It still has to go through an arbitration with RTB. And again, at the end of the day, this isn't what it says on the front of the 2 or the 4-month notice, but that's the reality of it. It has to go to an arbitration, or there is no order of possession. So this proactive action on behalf of the landlord puts them in the driver's seat. And if they're being proactive and they're filing on day 16, and they've done everything right up until that point, they can expect that down the road, 12 to 16 weeks, they're going to get an order of possession. And that's really what the whole gameplay is. and what has to happen. And if they do things right, it's going to happen. If they do things wrong, like I said earlier, they're going to be back at the start. So let's talk a little bit about potential risks and mitigation strategies. So, oh, there are no risks. Oh, there we go. There's a risk. So closing date is set without consideration of timeline for potential need of the order of possession through RTB. So you don't consider the 12 to 16 weeks. You write up the offer. The purchaser says, well, we want to close really quickly here on this. And so we want to get it going. But this is what we plan to do. We're going to be moving into it, or we're going to have our daughter move into it. Or they might be ready, totally upfront with you and say, we're going to renovate it and sell it. Or they might say, we're going to just give the tenants a 2-month notice and we're going to have them move out. We'll put people, new people in there to raise the rent. And I'll give you a really good example of this. Recently, we had a call from a friend of ours asking us to speak to their neighbor across the street who was a tenant. And we said, quite frankly, we usually don't work with tenants, we work with landlords. And they said, well, if you could just talk to her a little bit and see whether or not you're in a position to help her. So we talked to this gal, and she was living in the house right across the street from these people. The house was purchased, and she was served with a 2-month notice for landlord's use of the property. The landlord was going to move into the house. So everything was fine. She accepted the 2-month notice on face value. And coincidentally, the house right beside her came up for rent. And she was able to walk next door, look it over, do a deal with the landlord next door, and she moved out well within the 2 months. The deal closed as it should have, and everything was fine. Except the purchaser did not move into the house. The purchaser rented the house out again for more money. So the tenant became available, or became aware of that. She didn't quite know what to do with it. And talking with the people that contacted us, she found out that she had a remedy through the Residential Tenancy Act. And the Act clearly states that in situations like that, where the landlord has acted in bad faith, that they're going to end up paying her 12 months rent. And all she has to do is go through the process, file with RTB, go to an arbitration, tell them what happened. And short of the purchaser dying before they were able to move into the place, I don't think there's anything that RTB arbitrators will accept right now as another plausible reason for her having to move out of the place. And that's just the way that things have unfolded with RTB through this process. And a lot of it comes as a result of landlords acting in bad faith. And quite simply, they've colored everybody with the same colors, and they're just saying, you know what? At the end of the day, if this is what you're doing and you're acting in bad faith, this is what's going to happen. And they won't care, like I say, what the reason is, short of dying. So another risk is the tenant refuses to move within 2 months time frame. Well, if you follow the process and you file on day 16 after they've been served with the notice, and you've set the proper timelines in place, there should be lots of time for you to get an order of possession before the 12 to 16 weeks time comes up. And the 2-month notice thing is fine. It was great when it worked and you could have an arbitration in 6 to 8 weeks. And of course, now it's well past the 2 months by the time that this happens, and you're looking at 12 to 16 weeks for that to happen. Now, one thing that has just occurred to me that I didn't include in my slides or my presentation anywhere. So you serve the notice, and let's go back to that September 30th date that we were talking about for for when the deal is going to close, and you're going to have the tenants out by that date. After the 2 months comes up, on October the 1st, they're still sitting there because you haven't got to an arbitration yet. The arbitration is going to be in late November, December, somewhere in there. But they pay their rent on October the 1st, just like they have every other month. The landlord at that point has to serve them with a receipt, issue them a receipt that states that that money received is for use and occupancy only. If they don't do that, once again, when they get to arbitration, they're going to lose, because essentially that action of receiving the rent money without issuing the proper receipt has reinstated their tenancy. And it basically negates the 2-month notice. They'll be back to serving a 2-month notice and starting all over again. So then the landlord does not file for the order of possession immediately following a 15-day dispute window. And like I said, we received the call on the 2nd of January. On the 7th, the deal was closing. There's no time really to move forward with anything. Nobody filed. Everybody thought, well, these people are nice people, are going to move. This shouldn't be a problem. We've given them the 2-month notice as we should. So it's their responsibility to move. Well, everybody doesn't always do what they're supposed to. And the tenants will look at it from a different perspective and saying, you know what, they're trying to push us out because of this or that. And they will try to build a case of bad faith and do the best they can with it. They'll talk to your purchaser if they get a chance to do that. And sometimes people just drop these things when they're coming through, because they go through looking at a place, already thinking in their mind that they're going to buy this place as a rental property and put it in their rental portfolio. Yet when they're in the place, looking at the place with their realtor and walking through, they're talking about that sort of thing. And they're saying, well, you know, if we do this or that, then we could get more rent. If we renovate it a little bit and flip it, we can do this or that. And well, then maybe flipping's the right way to go. And they're having these conversations as they go through, forgetting that there are tenants standing there soaking this all up. And at the end of the day, the acting in bad faith scenario comes up, and the evidence came right out of the purchaser's mouth, or it came as a result of a conversation they overheard between the purchaser and the realtor, or a member of the purchaser's family that was looking at the place with them or whatever. And there they are. They're going to get burnt when they go to an arbitration because of it. So on the mitigation end of things, realtors can influence the purchase and sale agreement to allow the required time to obtain an order of possession. If you're explaining this to your client up front and saying to them, look, you know, I understand you want to buy this place, but there's tenants involved, so we have to allow for this time frame to take place, just in the event that these people are resistant to moving and we have to go to an arbitration. Because if we go to an arbitration, we're likely going to get an order of possession because you want to move into the property or you want it for your son or your daughter. But here's what happens if we don't put the required timelines in place. You know, your deal's not likely to close on time. It's going to be frustrated by what's going on, and you know, the deal may or may not collapse depending on the outcome of an agreement between the vendor and the purchaser. So very, very important thing to consider when you're putting together something on paper, and it's important for you as a realtor to know what they want the property for, so that you can give them the right information up front, and that way maybe avoid a very unpleasant situation. So the other thing, and I mentioned this earlier, purchasers and vendors can mutually agree to move up closing dates should additional time for RTB process not be needed. So the tenant moves out after 60 days, perfect. Conclude it right there. And now you can move your closing date up. If there's already a dispute filed with RTB, that dispute can be abandoned at that point. Filing fee on it's $100. So what? You know, absorb the loss and move on. the vendor can probably include that as a part of their expenses on their rental property. So it's not a big deal. It's more of a big deal if they don't follow through and do what they should do. And then here's where we got to with the realtor from January the 2nd. You have to, somewhere along the way, either the vendor or the purchaser, or the vendor and the purchaser, or the vendor and the purchaser and the realtor get together and say, you know what would it take to get you and your family packed and out the door here? Because in order for this deal to close, this is what's going to happen. When you've, for whatever reason, not left the required time to get a deal through RTB where you can get an order of possession, now you have to look at other alternatives. And that basically comes down to some sort of financial incentive where both parties are going to win. Okay. And we've used this quite often. We had a deal about a month ago in White Rock where there was a couple living in a basement suite. The couple that owned the house lived upstairs. They wanted, the purchasers wanted vacant possession. They were going to absorb the downstairs suite into their home and use the whole space for them and their family, which is all upfront and honest and good. But the deal was coming very close to closing, and the tenants were digging in. And the tenants were digging in because the vendor, first off, rather than serving a 2-month notice on the tenant, served them with a 1-month notice to end tenancy for cause. And then they were scrambling to figure out what the cause was, because they didn't have any legitimate causes that they could lean on. So they were with a 1-month notice in place. And I got a call from their realtor asking if there's something we could do to help. So first thing I asked is, well, what was the reason for the 1-month notice to end tenancy for cause? And the realtor didn't know. She had no idea. So she went and asked them, and she came back and said, well, basically they're just throwing mud at the wall to see if something's going to stick. Well, that's the wrong thing. So why don't we do it properly? Why don't we serve them with a 2-month notice and go from there? And at that point, we're only about 6 weeks away from closing. So I said, look, this is what the process is. This is how long it's going to take, that 12 to 6 weeks to get an arbitration if they dig in. Why don't we make them an offer on top of the 2-month notice? Like the 2-month notice, when you get served, you get 1 month's free rent. And depending on the condition of the place, you're going to get your security deposit back. Why don't we offer them 1 month free rent that they're going to get anyway, their security deposit back, flat out, you're going to get it back, and $1,000 cash. They thought it over and they said, okay, maybe that'll work. Why don't you talk to them about that? So I went and talked to the tenants and I said, look, that 1 month notice thing, that's abandoned totally. This is a 2-month notice, and this is what it does. And this is what you're eligible for under a 2-month notice. What I'd like you to consider is, and I always leave it like I still have to get the authority from the landlord. What if I go back to the landlord and I say to them, how about if you give them a financial incentive? And like, if we threw you an extra $1,000, would that help with your moving charges and that sort of thing? Would that sort of thing work for you? The tenant looked at me and he said, you know, it's much more pleasant dealing with you in this light than it was dealing with the landlord. The landlord was accusing us of things we didn't do and trying to get us out, rather than being upfront with us. You're being upfront, you're telling us what's going on, you're being very straightforward about it, and there's no problem. I will try to find a place and see if I can get my family moved by the deadline that you've given me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I find a place. About 10 days later, the tenant called me back and said, I found a place, I can move, I'm ready to do that. So I said, perfect. what's your moving date? We sorted it out, and in this case, it was May the 31st. And I said, okay, so on May the 31st, I will show up with your security deposit, 1 month's rent, and $1,000 cash. And you're going to give me the keys to the unit, and the unit's going to be vacant. Is that correct? Guy says, yes. He says, how do I know I can trust you? And I said, because we put every one of these agreements that we have with tenants into an agreement that both of us sign off on. And I said, at the end of the day, if the landlord doesn't come through, my company is going to go through because your agreement is with me and my company. And so we're going to put our name on the line here. We're going to expect that the landlord is going to do the right thing. And so far, we've never been wrong. They've always done the right thing when it comes to that. And that's what's going to happen. So in this particular case, it went through. It wasn't a problem at all. The tenant moved out. The deal went through, and everybody was happy. And we have found these things to be better able to be settled if everybody shows up at the table with the right attitude, and if the tenant sees that through this process there's something for them to gain, they're much more amenable to moving forward with an agreement that's going to work for both parties. So let's talk a little bit about tools and resources. And it says support via RTB. That's great. And it might be in the wrong order here. The most important part of all this is that your support that you have as realtors is your managing broker. Front line, first guy in line, the guy that you should be talking to. If you're getting into a deal where you're writing up an offer on a property and you're not sure about it because of there's tenants involved, not sure exactly what I should do or anything else, your first stop along the way should be your managing broker. Go talk to them, say, hey, here's what I'm doing. What do I need to do? They're either going to have an answer for you, or they're going to tell you where to go find an answer. And one of the places that might tell you to go is to RTB. So within RTB, you've got to deal with the 2-month notice, the proof of service, the RTB 42O. So that's the thing that I said, if the deal closes before you get to an arbitration, it's that form that is the landlord is going to have to file with RTB along with the state of title certificate, so that everybody knows who the new owner is. And RTB have an ongoing information line available at 660-1020. We use it frequently. It's open to everybody. They won't give you advice. They'll tell you right up front, we're not lawyers. If you're, and I'll tell you that too, I'm not a lawyer either. So I can give you advice. It might necessarily be good advice, but you might want to get the proper advice from RTB with respect to something like that. And if that's the case, perfect. They are likely to give you good information on what you should do or shouldn't do. And then, if your client is requiring support and they're not wanting to go through this process themselves, and they want to give us a call, we'll help them any way we can to move that forward. So that's the presentation I have for you today. I'm hopeful that I've answered questions that you may have already had. And if this presentation has spawned other questions in your mind, please feel free to ask them. I'm totally open to answering whatever questions I can.
Thank you so much, Jim. That was very informative for everyone. We do have a couple of questions that we'll try to get to in the last couple of minutes. Now, there's one question I did see here that I think you can answer. Are there any companies which can help the landlord to serve the notice?
That's something that we do. We will prepare the notice for them. We'll serve the notice for them. We'll file for RTB on their behalf. we have them sign an agent authorization that allows us to do that. If we don't have an agent authorization in place, then we will not act on their behalf. And that's just because of liability and all of that sort of thing, which I'm sure you're aware of.
We have a question from Jeff. Is video considered proof of service?
Not so far. No, we have people that will video and stuff. What I have done, and I haven't, to be honest, I haven't proof tested it yet with RTB, and I'm waiting for a case that allows me to do that so that I can give it a try. But what I have done is I have FaceTimed with my office. I have had them see the address of the house I'm at. I've had them on the FaceTime look at the notice that I'm posting and observe me posting it. I've set it up so that with FaceTime they can observe me doing that. So it's happening in real time. And then I've had them sign off on the proof of service. Like I say, this isn't something that I wouldn't run out and say, Jim said I should do this, but I'm waiting for an opportunity where I get challenged on that by an arbitrator so that we maybe can get a positive ruling out of it and be able to move forward with something. But so far, just taking a video doesn't work.
Okay. Now we have one question that has like a couple of parts to it. So I'll try to break it down for you. I'll ask the question as a whole and then we can go through it piece by piece. But what are some key tips on documentation or proof we need to keep when going to arbitration? What is the process like? And on average, how long does it take to get judgment after the hearing date? And what is the longest case you've seen? So we'll start with what are the key tips on documentation or proof we need to keep when going into an arbitration?
Well, the first thing is, so going into an arbitration with respect to a 2-month notice, what we'll be looking for is we'll be looking for a copy of the purchase and sale agreement and a copy of the BCREA form. And then we'll be looking for the 2-month notice and the proof of service. We'll also be attaching a copy of our agent authorization and a copy of the tenancy agreement, as well as any increases in rent that have taken place during the tenancy. Those are kind of the key components that we asked for. I'm just going to check with Anna, who's also here, and just see if there's something that I've missed out of that.
So a really important key to the evidence that you have to submit. Can everybody hear me? You don't need to see me, but just hear me. Okay. Is if the tenant raises the question of bad faith, I always go the extra mile because you just never know where the hearing is going to go on the day of. So I come prepared with evidence that the buyers in good faith intend on moving in. In fact, when I get a client who calls me and says, can you help me with this? I plan on moving in. My line of questioning to that person is, okay, you want to buy the property because you want to move in. Where are you currently living? And where you're are you renting or do you own? So you're renting, for example. All right. Have we got a copy of the rental agreement? And can you show me a copy of the notice you served to your landlord telling them that you plan to end your tenancy on such a date because you have purchased a property? If they can provide all of that evidence, it gives me comfort to know that, you know what, this is real. We're going to have a very real chance of getting an order of possession. If the answer is the house I currently live in, I own it, then my next question is, okay, so what do you plan on doing with that house? We have to prove to the arbitrator that you actually will be moving into the new house that you're buying. So they own the house. Some of their options might be, it's already listed for sale. Perfect. Give me a copy of that contract, to sell that listing. Or no, I am keeping the house, but I have hired a property manager to find tenants for the property. Here's the contract that I have signed with this property management company. Or it might even be as simple as, here are some ads that I've already put up listing my house for rent. All this to say that we must be able to prove to the arbitrator that, God forbid, the tenant uses the words, the reason I'm not moving out is because the buyer has served, like the 2-month notice has been served in bad faith. I have to be able to have all the, prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that that is not true and that the buyer truly plans on moving in. Here is all the evidence. So that is all evidence that I have in front of me for the day of the hearing, but it's also evidence that has already been submitted to RTB and shared with the tenant. Because if you don't provide it to RTB in advance and share it with the tenant, it will not even, you can't even speak to it as evidence.
That answers that question. And then the next part of it is, on average, how long does it take to get a judgment after the hearing date? And what is the longest case you've seen?
Okay, the longest we've seen is about 32 days, I think. And they're supposed to have it out within 30. On average, it's about a week. Sometimes, 3-4 days later, you have it. On the very odd occasion, the next day you have it. But it's just, generally speaking, within a week, you should have it.
Okay. And we have Tony who wants to go back to the example you had of the tenant paying rent on the October 1st example. Can you clarify the purpose of receipt after the landlord receives the rent from the tenant?
So the purpose of the receipt is to show that it's for use and occupancy. It's not for rent.
Okay.
Okay, and that's the whole thing. If you're showing it as a receipt for use and occupancy, that's acceptable to RTB. If you don't issue that receipt and the tenant's evidence says, well, I paid them rent on October the 1st, and you can't counter that evidence by saying, here's a receipt for use and occupancy on that date, then you've basically reinstated the tenancy.
So if I can just elaborate on that.
Mm-hmm.
On the 2-month notice, we basically told the tenant that his tenancy will end on September 30th, for example. So by issuing that receipt, which states that we are accepting the money for use and occupancy only, means that we still feel that your tenancy officially ended September 30th. But because you're still living in the property and we don't have the right to come and physically remove you, we do have the right to accept some money, because at the end of the day, you can't be expected to live there for free. But we have to declare that the money is being accepted for use and occupancy only, and it is not being accepted as rent money. Because accepting it as rent money constitutes that you have a tenancy. Well, our 2-month notice just said that we want to end your tenancy September 30th, right?
So one flies in the face of the other.
Okay. So I do want to mention, I know it is 12 o'clock. So for those that need to leave, you may log off now. I know you may have some showings. We are going to try to go through a couple more questions for those that can't stay on, Jim, if that is okay.
Oh, you bet.
Perfect. Okay. So who is responsible to pay the 12 months penalties, the previous landlord or the buyer?
That will likely be determined by the arbitrator. And my guess is it could go either way. The arbitrator could decide both parties are responsible, could decide one party is responsible. And I wouldn't guess on that one way or the other, because with every arbitrator comes a different decision. So.
Okay. And So someone has a situation, a tenant didn't pay for 2 months and moved out. Is there any way a landlord is able to get those 2 months of rent back?
If they have a place to serve them with documents, then they can start a process through RTB to get a monetary order that would make them responsible for paying the back rent.
Okay. Let's see, I'm just running through some of these questions. So some of these. Oh, I think I know the answer to this one, but can the landlord issue the 2 months notice to end tenancy by way of email?
No,
Uh,
not unless there's an agreement, signed agreement in place between the landlord and the tenant, whereby the tenant agrees to accept email service of documents. If that is in place, they can do that. If there's no written agreement in place, and in most cases so far, that agreement is not in place. It's only been an option that's been available for about the last year. And it was spawned because of COVID. And quite simply, most people don't have that agreement in place. A lot of new agreements are putting it in place, and it makes it much easier to deal with, but for the most part, it's not there.
Okay. Do you suggest we file the order of possession as a more secure way, even if the tenant said they would move?
Absolutely.
100%.
Okay. That might have been their decision at the time you were talking to them. And in all likelihood, that decision has changed, and they are now going to stick it out and just stay as long as they can, because maybe they can't find a place to move to. So if you're going to protect yourself and protect the integrity of the deal that you're doing, then you'll file for the order of possession no matter what the tenant says. And quite often we'll tell the tenant up front, this is the process that we have to follow. So you can expect that you're going to get served some documents at some point here that say we've applied for an order of possession. That's just part of the process. And you know, you found a place and you're moving, then don't worry about it. All that will just go by the wayside, and whatever dispute will be withdrawn, and it won't be happening. But here's what we can do up front to show you what our integrity is, and it's just by telling you what the process is and how it works, and as simple as that.
I have 3 questions that I'm going to roll into one. So one person is asking, is it the buyer or seller agent who's supposed to serve the notice of ending tenancy, and whose responsibility will it be to remove the tenant, and who would have to pay for the month's worth of rent compensation?
So the landlord is responsible for initiating the process. Okay, so it's the landlord that's going to, so the purchaser's agent is serving the BCREA form on the seller's agent. It's the seller, who is the landlord, who has to serve the 2-month notice on the tenant. It's their responsibility to do that and to prepare the proof of service, make sure it's executed properly. And then as far as the security deposit, the security deposit is going to come from the landlord vendor who already has it. Okay, it's already in their possession, and that will likely form part of the statement of adjustments. If the deal closes when the tenant's still there, then the security deposit is likely to go to the new landlord in it, and that money will have to come back from them to the tenant once an adjudication has been made.
And
that,
sorry?
Yeah, does that kind of capture it?
Yep. And I have another question from Lisa. What if the tenant refuses to accept registered mail? What is our processes after that?
You're laughing, Lisa. It's a wonderful scenario, because the Residential Tenancy Act says that it's deemed served after 5 days. So whether they pick their mail up or don't pick their mail up isn't going to matter in the process. The 15 days to dispute starts on day 6 after you've mailed it. So basically, at day 21, 3 weeks later, if they haven't picked up the registered mail, then you file for your order of possession. They had an opportunity to dispute it and they chose not to do that. So really it puts the landlord in the driver's seat if they're not disputing, because quite simply, when you get to an arbitration, you can say, here's what happened, here's how service happened. The arbitrator will look at the registered mail receipt. We have them pulling them right up on their computer and saying, yeah, hang on, I'm just checking with Canada Post to see that it was properly done. And yes, it is. Yeah, it was at the post office for them to pick up, and they were given 2 notices to go get it. So too bad on them.
Okay, so last question, just so that we can wrap it back from the beginning. So to clarify, after landlords file an order of possession, the tenant has 60 days to move out. And if they don't move out in 60 days, what would be their next step?
So on day 16, as long as they filed for an order of possession, it's going to go to an arbitration. They're going to get an order of possession when it goes to arbitration, provided there's no allegation that's substantiated for bad faith. They get the order of possession, they serve it on the tenant. If the tenant does still not move out after being served with the order of possession, then the landlord can go to Supreme Court, get a writ of possession, and in that case, once that's done, they can engage a realtor, or not a realtor, a bailiff, to come in and remove the tenants. So it's as long as you put the building blocks in place, it works and you can get there. It's when there's flaws along the way and you don't do things properly and you cause yourself a bunch of grief as a landlord that you get into these problem situations. And quite simply, they can be avoided if you just follow the process that's there. And if you don't know the process and you're not comfortable with the process, find somebody who is.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jim and Anna. We appreciate you joining us today, and thank you for everyone for attending.